The letter arrived on a Tuesday in October of 1856, carried by a mail rider who looked half frozen and thoroughly annoyed at having ridden 12 miles into the Kentucky hills for a single envelope. Silas Crenshaw stood at the fence post of his father's property, his brother's property now, and turned the yellowed paper over in his calloused hands. The wind was coming down off the ridge to the north, carrying with it the smell of dying leaves and chimney smoke, and the faint metallic promise of an early frost. His father had been dead 3 weeks. The will had already been read. The farmhouse, with its 200 acres of cleared bottomland and its fat tobacco barn and its orchard of 40 apple trees that bore so heavily in September that the branches had to be propped with poles, went to Denton, the eldest. The general store in Harlan, a solid 2-story frame building with living quarters above and a steady trade below, went to Wallace, the middle son. The 3 draft horses, the breeding cows, the savings account at the Harlan County Bank containing $714, divided between the 2 of them, clean as a knife through butter. To Silas, the youngest, went a single parcel. 40 acres of uncleared ridgeland 6 miles north of the Crenshaw homestead, anchored by what the deed described as the cave property, formerly Ridley's farm, including all structures and mineral rights therein. Ridley's farm. Even the name was a joke in Harlan County. Old Josiah Ridley had tried to run cattle on that land for 11 years before giving up in 1843, defeated by the terrain, the isolation, and the limestone bluff that shed rock onto his meager pastures every spring. The pastures themselves were more rock than grass. The ridge was too steep for a plow. The timber was decent, oak and hickory and tulip poplar, but the hauling distance to any mill or market made it barely worth the effort. And the cave, a gaping mouth in the limestone bluff that had swallowed Ridley's best calf one wet spring and never given it back, was considered more hazard than asset. Silas's father had purchased the whole property for back taxes in 1849, a sum of $11 so small it barely warranted the ink on the receipt. He had never visited it, never improved it, and never mentioned it except once at supper, when he'd called it 40 acres of nothing useful. The cave farm, Denton said that evening at supper, and his wife Margaret laughed into her napkin. She had a way of laughing that managed to be both delicate and cruel, like a hatpin. Wallace shook his head slowly, the way a man does when he pities something too small to bother kicking. His wife, Ruth, studied her plate and said nothing, which was Ruth's way. "You could sell the timber," Wallace offered, and there was something in his voice that was almost kind. Almost. "Might get $40, $50 for the hardwood if you could find a man fool enough to haul it off that ridge. Or you could stay on here," Denton said, leaning back in the chair that had been their father's, already claiming it with his body the way the will had claimed it with words. "There's always work to be done. I could use a hand with the south field come spring. A hired man. On the land where he'd been born. Working the fields he'd worked since he was old enough to hold a hoe, but now as a laborer, not a son." Silas looked at the letter from the county clerk confirming the deed transfer and felt something settle in his chest like a stone finding the bottom of a well. Not anger. He'd burned through anger years ago, somewhere around the 100th time his father had introduced him as "my youngest, the reader," in a tone that made reading sound like a disease. Not self-pity either. He'd seen what self-pity did to a man and wanted no part of it. No, what settled in him now was something quieter and harder. Decision. "I'll go have a look at it," Silas said. Denton and Wallace exchanged a glance that Silas had seen 1,000 times, the glance that said, "Let him. He'll be back before the first frost." Margaret smiled into her coffee cup. "You'll want to take a good lantern," she said, her voice bright with helpfulness. "For the cave. I hear it's ever so dark." Silas looked at her. She met his eyes, still smiling. He held the gaze for 2 seconds, 3, 4, long enough that her smile flickered. And then he folded the letter, placed it in his breast pocket, and excused himself from the table. He slept that night in the barn, which he preferred to the house anyway. The house was full of his father's absence, and his brother's presence, and the particular suffocating atmosphere that settles over a home when the balance of power has shifted, and everyone knows it, but no one has the decency to say it plainly. He left on the morning of October 14th, 1856, with a mule named Bishop, a bedroll, 2 crates of books, a box of tools that included a hammer, a handsaw, 2 chisels, a brace and bit, a level, and a draw knife, and $47 in paper money and coin. The ride north took most of the day. The trail, if it could be called that, wound through stands of sugar maple and white oak blazing with autumn color, the hills rolling like the backs of sleeping animals under a sky so blue it hurt to look at. Twice he had to dismount and lead Bishop around washouts where the spring rains had carved the trail down to raw clay and exposed limestone. Once, a copperhead slid across the path ahead of them, and Bishop stopped dead, his ears flat, until Silas talked him forward in a low, steady voice. The land changed as he climbed. The bottomland hardwoods gave way to drier species, chestnut oak, Virginia pine, mountain laurel thick in the understory. The soil thinned, outcrops of gray limestone appeared along the trail, layered and ancient, the compressed memory of a sea that had covered this land 300 million years ago. Silas knew this because he had read it in a geology text he'd borrowed from a professor in Lexington 2 years earlier, a man named Harmon, who had been surprised and then pleased to find a young farmer who cared about the age of rocks. Silas had carried that book in his saddlebag for 6 months, reading it by candlelight until the binding cracked. He reached the property just as the afternoon light was going gold and long through the trees. The ridge rose steeply from a narrow creek bottom. The creek itself, perhaps 4 feet wide, running clear over a bed of smooth limestone cobbles, and the cave entrance sat about 40 feet up the slope, partially hidden by a curtain of Virginia creeper that had gone scarlet with the season. Below it, the remains of Josiah Ridley's cabin sagged on its foundation stones like a man who'd sat down and never planned to get up again. The roof had caved in. The chimney stood alone, a stone finger pointing at nothing. A rusted iron pot lay on its side in what had been the dooryard, half buried in leaves. Silas tied Bishop to a hickory tree, gave him an apple from his pack, and climbed. The cave mouth was wider than he'd expected, perhaps 15 feet across and 8 feet high, shaped roughly like an arch. The floor was dry, hard-packed clay over limestone, worn smooth in places. Ferns grew along the lower edges of the opening where moisture collected. A daddy-long-legs moved deliberately across the wall near his hand. He lit the oil lantern he'd brought and stepped inside. Cool air moved against his face, steady as breathing. He stopped, held the lantern higher. The passage extended back into the hillside farther than the light could reach, the walls close enough to touch on either side for the first 20 feet, then opening into a broader space. The ceiling was low here, perhaps 6 feet, and he ducked instinctively. Water had carved this place over millennia, patient as prayer, dissolving the limestone grain by grain, until it left behind rooms and corridors and cathedral spaces deep in the earth. He could see the evidence of that patience in the walls. Smooth, undulating surfaces sculpted by water that was no longer here, scalloped patterns that geologists called dissolution features, each one a record of flow and time measured in thousands of years. But it was the air that arrested him. It was October, and the evening chill had already settled into the hollows outside, the temperature dropping toward freezing as the sun went down. He'd felt it on the climb, the cold pressing against his back, seeping through his coat. Here, inside the cave, the air was warm. Not hot, not like a fire or a stove, but warm the way a wool blanket is warm, steady, encompassing, unhurried. The stone walls, when he pressed his palm against them, were the temperature of living skin. Silas Crenshaw stood in the entrance of his inheritance and felt the mountain breathe around him, and something in his chest that had been clenched for years, clenched since his mother's death when he was 14, clenched tighter with each year of his father's benign neglect, clenched tightest in the weeks since the will, slowly began to unclench. He slept that first night just inside the cave mouth, wrapped in his bedroll on a bed of dry leaves that had blown in from outside. Bishop stood tied in the hollow below, occasionally stamping and blowing. Outside, the temperature dropped to 28 degrees. He'd know this later, after he'd acquired a thermometer. Inside, where the cave walls arched above him like cupped hands, the air held at what he would eventually measure as 54 degrees. He woke at dawn to the sound of the creek below and a wild turkey calling somewhere on the ridge. The air inside the cave was still warm. The stone was still warm. He lay there for a long time, looking at the ceiling in the gray early light, thinking about what he had and what it might mean. The first 3 weeks were brutal and necessary. Silas cleared the brush from around the cave entrance with the handsaw and a borrowed axe, cutting back the Virginia creeper and the mountain laurel until the full width of the opening was exposed to light and air. He salvaged what he could from Ridley's collapsed cabin, mostly good foundation stones, a handful of still sound oak beams, several dozen usable boards, and a set of iron hinges that had rusted but could be filed clean. He dragged everything up the slope to the cave mouth, trip after trip, his arms burning and his boots sliding on the loose limestone scree. He built a rough wall across the cave mouth with a frame for a door and a window. The wall was made of stacked limestone chinked with clay from the creek bank, mixed with dry grass in the old way his mother had taught him before she died. She had been a practical woman, his mother, the daughter of a Pennsylvania Dutch family who knew how to build and mend and preserve and make do. She had taught Silas to read before the school teacher got hold of him, and she had taught him to work with his hands before his father could teach him that such work was beneath a landowner's son. She died of scarlet fever in 1840, and Silas had carried her lessons the way he carried her face in his memory, carefully, daily, without display. He was not a large man, 5'9", lean as a fence rail, with hands that were strong but not powerful. Hands built for precision rather than force, the hands of a craftsman rather than a laborer. His face was angular, with deep-set gray eyes that people sometimes found unsettling because they were the eyes of a man who was thinking when other men were talking. What he had was patience, and what his brothers had always dismissed as a weakness, his habit of stopping to think before acting, of reading about a thing before attempting it, of watching how the water ran before deciding where to dig, turned out to be the most useful tool in his kit. Before he built anything, he observed, he spent the first 4 days simply walking the cave, mapping it with a notebook and a ball of twine. He tied one end of the twine to a spike driven into the wall near the entrance and let it unspool behind him as he walked, measuring distances by counting the arm lengths of twine he released. The main passage ran roughly northeast for about 200 feet before branching into 3 smaller corridors. The largest chamber, he would come to call it the Great Room, was approximately 30 feet wide and 20 feet high, with a ceiling that rose to a natural dome studded with small stalactites, some no longer than a finger, others as long as his arm. The floor was level, covered in a fine clay that was dry to the touch. The walls were smooth, the color of raw cream, with occasional bands of darker stone, chert or flint, running through the limestone like veins. And everywhere, the temperature held steady. He purchased a mercury thermometer in Harlan, 75 cents, a significant expenditure, and began recording. He checked the temperature at the cave entrance, at the Great Room, and at the farthest point he could reach in each corridor. He checked it at dawn, at noon, and at midnight. He recorded the outside temperature alongside the inside temperature, noting weather conditions, wind direction, and cloud cover. He recorded everything in a leather-bound notebook in handwriting that was small and precise, the handwriting of a man who understood that data was a form of respect paid to the truth. Outside, October gave way to November, and the temperatures swung from 55 degrees on warm afternoons to 22 on bitter nights. Inside the cave, at any point more than 30 feet from the entrance, the thermometer read between 54 and 58 degrees. Always. Morning, noon, night, rain or shine. It did not waver. It did not care what the sky was doing. The cave kept its own counsel, and its counsel was 56 degrees. Silas had read enough. The geology texts, newspaper accounts of Mammoth Cave to the west, a borrowed copy of Lyell's Principles of Geology, to understand the principle, at least in outline. The earth itself was a reservoir of heat. Below a certain depth, the temperature of the ground reflected not the weather of the day or the season, but the average annual temperature of the region, maintained by the slow, steady flux of heat from the planet's interior and the accumulated warmth of the sun. In central Kentucky, that average hovered around 56 degrees. The massive limestone walls of the cave, hundreds of feet thick in places, acted as what a later age would call thermal mass, absorbing heat in summer, releasing it in winter, buffering the interior against the wild swings of the surface world. It was insulation and furnace and regulator all at once, built by geology and maintained by physics, and it required no fuel, no maintenance, and no human cleverness to operate. The cave breathed too. He noticed it on the 3rd day. A gentle but persistent current of air flowing outward from the cave mouth during the day and reversing direction at night. During the day, the sun warmed the air outside until it was lighter than the cool, dense air inside the cave. The cave exhaled. At night, the process reversed. The outside air cooled and grew heavy, sliding into the cave mouth and pushing the warmer inside air up and out through unseen fissures higher on the ridge. This natural convection kept the air fresh and prevented the staleness and dampness that plagued most caves. The cave wasn't just a shelter. It was a ventilation system, engineered by thermodynamics and running on nothing but the difference between the temperature of the earth and the temperature of the sky. He was not living in a hole in the ground. He was living inside a machine, an ancient, elegant machine that the earth had spent 100 million years building. All it asked was that someone be smart enough to recognize what it was. By late November, Silas had built a serviceable living space inside the first 60 feet of the cave. The entrance wall, now complete with a solid oak door on Ridley's salvaged hinges and 2 glass windows he'd hauled from Harlan at considerable expense, $4.50 for the pair, which made him wince, turned the cave mouth into something resembling a cabin's front wall. Inside, He'd laid a plank floor over the clay, built a simple bed frame from oak boards, and constructed a table, a chair, and shelves for his books and supplies. A small iron stove, the only concession to conventional heating, sat near the entrance, its chimney pipe running up through a gap he'd left in the entrance wall. He used it for cooking and for supplemental warmth on the coldest nights, but he found he rarely needed it for heat alone. The cave provided. The great room, deeper in the cave, he left mostly untouched for now. It was his cathedral, his library, his thinking space. He set a second chair and a reading table there, carried back on one of his supply trips, and in the evenings he would carry his lantern back and sit in that vast silence, reading by the steady yellow light while the mountain hummed its low geological song around him. He read Lyell and Humboldt and a borrowed copy of Darwin's Voyage of the Beagle. He read Emerson's essays and Thoreau's Walden, which had been published 2 years earlier and which struck him with the force of recognition. Here was another man who had chosen to live deliberately, to reduce life to its essential elements, though Thoreau had a pond and Silas had a cave, and Silas suspected the cave was warmer. Winter came hard that year. The first real snow fell on December 9th, a heavy, wet fall that bent the trees and turned the creek to a black ribbon between white banks. The temperature outside dropped to 4 degrees on the worst night, a bitter cold that cracked limbs and drove the wildlife deep into their dens. Inside the cave, Silas's thermometer read 55. He sat at his table with a cup of coffee heated on the iron stove and wrote in his notebook, December 12th. Outside temperature 4 degrees Fahrenheit at dawn, wind northwest, clear sky. Inside temperature at great room 55 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside temperature at entrance 48 degrees Fahrenheit. Door gap admits cold draft, must improve seal. Cave breath reversed at approximately 3 a.m. Noted strong inward flow of cold air. He filled 3 notebooks that first winter with observations, temperatures, air movement, humidity, the behavior of water seepage along the walls, the way certain formations seemed to grow imperceptibly over the weeks, tiny deposits of calcite left behind by mineral-laden water that trickled along established paths. He sketched the cave walls in cross-section. He sketched the stalactites. He wrote down questions he couldn't yet answer and underlined them twice. Word got around, as it does in small communities where gossip is both currency and entertainment. The people of Harlan knew about Silas Crenshaw's inheritance, and they knew he'd actually gone to live on it, and the general opinion was that he'd lost whatever sense God had given him. "Living in a cave like a bear," said Tom Suttles at the general store. Wallace's store now. Always was the odd one. "He'll come down off that ridge before February," predicted Horace Breen, who ran the livery stable. "Frozen solid or starved thin, one or the other." "His mother was peculiar, too," offered Agnes Whitfield, who had opinions about everyone. "Pennsylvania people. They have strange ideas." Silas heard these things second-hand, carried to him by the mail rider or by the occasional hunter who passed through his hollow. He said nothing in response. Words were just sounds. They couldn't hurt him unless he let them. He had learned this slowly, over many years, the way a man learns to walk on ice. Not by being told how, but by falling enough times to understand what falling costs. What he did, instead of arguing, was build. The spring of 1857 brought 2 things that would shape the next decade of Silas Crenshaw's life. The first was a discovery. The second was a woman. The discovery came in March, when the snowmelt sent water coursing through passages that had been dry all winter. New trickles appeared along the walls, new drips from the ceiling, new rivulets running along the floor in channels carved so long ago that the stone was polished smooth. Silas followed one of these new streams deep into the third corridor, the one he'd explored the least because it narrowed to a tight squeeze about 80 feet in, a slot in the rock barely 18 inches wide that required him to turn sideways and exhale to pass through. But the water was going somewhere, and curiosity had always been the one appetite Silas could not suppress. It was the trait his father had liked least about him. The questions, the books, the habit of disappearing for hours to investigate something that had caught his attention. But what his father had seen as distraction, Silas understood as orientation. Curiosity was how he found his way. He turned sideways, pressed through the narrow slot, the rock scraping his chest and back, the lantern held out ahead of him in one extended arm, and emerged into a chamber he had never seen. It was not large, perhaps 12 feet across and 9 feet high, roughly oval, with a ceiling that curved down to meet the walls in a smooth, continuous surface. The floor was damp but solid, and the walls were alive. Everywhere he turned the lantern, the light fractured and returned to him multiplied, broken into spectrums of amber and white and pale rose. Calcite crystals covered every surface, some no bigger than a thumbnail, others as long as his forearm, growing in radiating clusters that looked like frozen starbursts or the petals of impossible flowers. The ceiling was thick with them, glittering formations that caught his lantern light and threw it back in 1,000 tiny fires, so that the small chamber blazed and sparkled as if the inside of the mountain were studded with diamonds. He turned slowly, and the light turned with him, and the crystals gave it back changed. Warmer, softer, broken into colors that had no name. He stood there for a long time, breathing. The air in the chamber was slightly warmer than the rest of the cave, 58 degrees he would later measure, and very still, as if the room had been holding its breath for millennia and had just now been given permission to exhale. He knew enough geology to recognize what he was seeing. These were calcite spar crystals, specifically the variety known as dog-tooth spar for the way the individual crystals came to sharp, canine points. They were formed over thousands of years by the slow precipitation of calcium carbonate from supersaturated water seeping through the limestone. The conditions had to be precise, the right mineral concentration, the right temperature, the right rate of water flow, the right pH, the right absence of disturbance. This chamber had been sealed, or nearly sealed, for perhaps 10,000 years, growing its crystals in darkness and silence the way a cathedral grows its reputation, slowly, without witnesses, and to magnificent effect. He touched nothing. He backed out of the chamber carefully, pressing through the narrow slot with even more care than he'd entered, and sat in the great room for an hour, thinking. His hands, he noticed, were trembling, not with cold, never with cold in this place, but with the particular excitement of a man who has found something he didn't know he was looking for. What he had was rare. He was almost certain of that. He'd read accounts of crystal caves in Mexico and in the Alps, but nothing about one in Kentucky. The formations were extraordinary, not just scientifically interesting, but genuinely beautiful, the kind of thing that made a person reconsider what the word treasure meant. His brothers had laughed at his inheritance. 40 acres of nothing useful. A cave that swallowed calves. And hidden inside it, behind a gap barely wide enough to slip through, was a room full of crystals that might have been growing since before the pyramids were built. But Silas Crenshaw was not a man given to haste. He spent the next 2 weeks carefully documenting the crystal chamber, returning each day with his notebook and lantern, sketching every formation from multiple angles, measuring temperatures and humidity at different points in the chamber, noting the direction and rate of water flow along the walls. He was methodical to the point of obsession, because he understood that the first description of something rare carries a responsibility. Get it wrong, and you've wasted the opportunity. Get it right, and you've created a record that outlasts you. Only then did he write a letter. It went to Professor James Harmon at Transylvania University in Lexington, the geologist whose book on Kentucky limestone formations Silas had borrowed and read twice, and returned with a 4-page letter of questions that had apparently delighted the professor. Their correspondence had continued intermittently for 2 years, Harmon answering Silas's questions with the generous patience of a man who recognized genuine curiosity when he saw it. The letter was 3 pages long, precise, detailed, and modest. It described the cave, the thermal properties, the crystal chamber, the conditions, and the formations. It asked, simply, whether the professor might have any interest in visiting. Professor Harmon arrived 6 weeks later, on a borrowed horse, with 2 leather cases of instruments and an expression of barely contained skepticism that lasted exactly as long as it took Silas to lead him through the narrow slot and into the crystal chamber. "Good God," Harmon whispered, holding his lantern up to the ceiling. The crystals threw light across his face in shifting kaleidoscopic patterns. "Good God, Crenshaw, do you know what you have here?" "I know it's calcite spar," Silas said quietly. "Dogtooth variety, I believe." "Dogtooth variety," he says. Harmon laughed, not unkindly, but with the helpless delight of a man seeing something he'd only theorized about. "This is one of the finest displays of dogtooth spar I've ever encountered outside of a European museum, possibly finer. Look at the clarity. Look at the size of these terminations." He moved closer to a cluster near the floor, a radiating fan of amber-tinted crystals, each as thick as 2 fingers and as long as a man's hand. There are collectors in New York and Philadelphia who would pay $100 for a single specimen this size. There are museums that would mortgage their buildings. "I'm not interested in tearing them out of the walls," Silas said. Harmon looked at him for a long moment, the lantern light moving across both their faces. Then he nodded slowly, and something in his expression changed, shifted from the excited acquisitiveness of a collector to something more like respect. "No," he said. "No, I don't suppose you are. Then what do you intend to do with them?" "Understand them," Silas said, "and show them to people who want to understand them too." The second thing that spring brought was Clara Holtz. She arrived in Harlan County in April of 1857, the daughter of a German immigrant family that had settled in Louisville a decade earlier. Her father, Heinrich Holtz, had been a watchmaker, not the kind who sold cheap timepieces from a counter, but the kind who built and repaired precision instruments, chronometers, and astronomical clocks, and the delicate mechanisms that measured seconds the way Silas measured degrees. Heinrich had died of cholera the previous year, suddenly and badly, and Clara's mother, unable to maintain the shop alone and unwilling to sell it to a competitor who would cheapen the name, had sent Clara to live with her uncle Friedrich, who ran a small pharmacy in Harlan. Clara was 24, dark-haired, with her father's sharp features and her mother's steady hands. She was quiet in the way of someone who listens more than she speaks, and she had read more books than any woman, and most men, in Harlan County, in both English and German. She had her father's tools, which she kept in a leather roll as carefully as a surgeon keeps scalpels, and she had his eye for mechanism and precision, which she applied to everything from pharmacy work to her uncle's hopeless bookkeeping. Silas met her at the pharmacy. He'd come to town for lamp oil, sulfur matches, and a new thermometer. His first one had cracked when he'd dropped it on the cave floor, an accident that had pained him more than most physical injuries. Clara was behind the counter, reorganizing the patent medicine shelves with an expression of concentrated disapproval that Silas would come to know very well. "Half of these are worthless," she said, apparently to no one in particular, holding up a bottle of Dr. Pemberton's celebrated liver tonic. "This is colored water and alcohol. The label claims it cures consumption, dyspepsia, and melancholy. That's like claiming a hat cures rain." "The alcohol probably helps with the melancholy," Silas said. She looked at him. He looked at her. Something passed between them that was not quite electricity and not quite recognition, but had qualities of both. A frequency matched, a tuning fork struck. "You're the caveman," she said. It was not a question, and there was no mockery in it. It was a statement of identification. The way you might say, "You're the clockmaker," or "You're the one who reads." "I prefer to think of myself as a man who lives in a cave," Silas said. "There's a distinction." "Is there?" "One implies regression. The other implies choice." Clara set down the bottle of liver tonic. "My father had a book about Mammoth Cave," she said. "He read it 3 times. He said the earth remembers temperatures the way people remember songs, faithfully, over long periods, without being asked." Silas stood in the pharmacy with his lamp oil and his sulfur matches and felt, for the first time in longer than he could remember, that he was being seen. Not assessed for his usefulness, not pitied for his circumstances, not dismissed for his unconventional choices. Seen, the way you see a landscape when you stop walking long enough to actually look at it. "Would you like to see it?" he asked. "The cave?" "Yes," Clara said. "I would." She came the following Saturday, riding her uncle's horse up the ridge trail with a notebook of her own and a shawl that she stopped needing about 30 feet inside the entrance. 56 degrees, she said, reading his thermometer with the quick precision of a watchmaker's daughter. "In April." "In April, in August, in January," Silas said. "It doesn't change." He showed her everything: the living quarters, the great room, the crystal chamber. She moved through the cave the way she moved through conversation, carefully, attentively, with an economy of motion that suggested she valued what she was seeing too much to rush through it. In the crystal chamber, she stood very still for a long time, the lantern light fracturing around her, her face illuminated from 100 angles at once. Then she said, "My father would have cried." They talked for 4 hours that first visit, about geothermal principles and crystal formation, about her father's clockwork, and how he'd explained entropy to her when she was 9, about Silas's notebooks and his correspondence with Professor Harmon, about the absurdity of patent medicines and the deeper absurdity of a world that valued loud confidence over quiet competence. She asked questions he hadn't thought of. He showed her data she immediately saw patterns in. She came back the following Saturday, and the one after that, and the one after that. By June, it was understood in Harlan that the caveman and the German girl were courting, and the town's opinion was divided between those who thought it was romantic and those who thought it proved they were both peculiar. Margaret, Denton's wife, was heard to say that Silas was dragging that poor girl into his hole in the ground, which was perhaps the most uncharitable description of a courtship ever offered in Harlan County. They married on September 3rd, 1857, in a small ceremony at the Harlan Methodist Church. Clara wore her mother's dress, sent from Louisville, in a trunk that also contained 6 of her father's books and a set of precision calipers. Silas wore a new shirt he'd bought for the occasion and the same boots he wore every day, cleaned and oiled. Neither Denton nor Wallace attended the ceremony, though Wallace sent a set of kitchen knives with a note that said, simply, "For the cave." It was the most generous thing Wallace had ever done, and Silas kept those knives for the rest of his life. Clara moved onto the ridge, and the cave began to change. Not its geology. That continued its patient millennial work without reference to human timelines. What changed was the way it was inhabited. Clara brought curtains for the entrance wall windows. Simple muslin, but they softened the light and made the space feel like a home rather than an outpost. She brought seeds for a garden on the sunny slope below the cave mouth: potatoes, beans, squash, herbs, and a row of sunflowers that she planted along the trail because, she said, even a cave needs a doorbell. She brought her father's tools and began helping Silas with his crystal documentation, sketching formations with an accuracy and delicacy that made his own drawings look like a child's. She rendered the crystals in cross-section and in elevation, noting angles and dimensions with the rigor of an engineer and the eye of an artist. She also brought, without fanfare or announcement, a gift for organization that transformed Silas's scattered notebooks into a proper archive. She created an indexing system, cross-referencing his temperature readings with geological observations, weather records, and lunar phases. She suggested he begin recording barometric pressure, which she measured with a device she built herself from a glass jar, a piece of India rubber, and a wheat straw, a homemade barometer that was crude in appearance and remarkably accurate in function. "You're doing science," she told him one evening as they sat in the great room reading by lamplight, the cave quiet around them except for the faint, omnipresent drip of water somewhere deeper in the passages. "You just don't know it yet." "I know it," he said. "I just didn't have a word for it." "The word is research," she said, and smiled at him, and the lantern light caught the crystals behind her and scattered itself across the ceiling in 100 tiny stars. The years between 1858 and 1867 were the building years, the years of slow accumulation and steady growth, and they passed the way good years pass, quickly in memory, richly in experience. Professor Harmon published a paper on the cave's crystal formations in the Journal of Natural Philosophy in 1858, crediting Silas as discoverer and primary observer. The paper attracted attention from geologists and mineralogists across the eastern states. Letters arrived from Yale, from the Smithsonian, from a German mineralogist who had read a translation and wanted to compare Silas's formations with similar discoveries in the Black Forest. Visitors began arriving, first a trickle, then a steady stream. Scientists, mostly, but also curiosity seekers, journalists, and the occasional wealthy collector who offered increasingly large sums for crystal specimens. Silas refused every offer to sell. The crystals had taken 10,000 years to grow. Pulling them from the walls for a parlor display case struck him as an act of vandalism so profound it didn't even need a moral argument. It was simply stupid. The way burning a library is stupid. Instead, he and Clara developed a different model. They would guide visitors through the cave for a modest fee, $2 for a standard tour of the main passage and great room, $5 for the extended tour that included the crystal chamber. And Silas would explain the geology, the thermal properties, the formation processes, and the ecology of the cave system as they walked. He was, it turned out, a gifted teacher, not in the dramatic, lecturing sense, but in the quiet way of a man who genuinely understood what he was explaining and who cared whether his listener understood it too. He had a knack for analogy, comparing the cave's thermal regulation to a root cellar, or crystal growth to the way ice forms on a window pane, or the cave's breathing to the way a bellows works, that made complex ideas accessible without condescending. The tours brought income. Not wealth, not at first, but enough to improve the property substantially. Silas built a proper cabin at the base of the ridge for visitors to rest in before or after their tours. He improved the trail, cutting steps into the steeper sections and installing handrails of peeled hickory. He put rope guides along the cave passages and built wooden walkways over the rougher sections of floor. He placed oil lanterns at intervals through the main passage so that the cave was lit softly as visitors moved through it, the crystals catching and multiplying the light until the whole passage seemed to glow from within. Clara managed the business side, correspondence, scheduling, accounts, with the same precision she brought to everything. She also began a natural history collection in the great room, displaying fossils found in the cave walls, mineral specimens from the surrounding hills, and pressed plants from the ridge, each carefully labeled in her neat, angular handwriting. Visitors often spent as much time examining her displays as they did looking at the crystal formations. Their first child, Thomas, was born in April of 1859 in the cave, delivered by a midwife from Harlan, who grumbled about the ride up the ridge but admitted afterward that she'd never attended a birth in a more comfortable room. "Warm as toast in there," she told anyone who'd listen, "and that baby didn't even cry." Their daughter Eleanor followed in 1861, born in early spring with the dogwoods blooming white on the ridge below and the cave breathing its steady, warm breath over her cradle. A second son, James, came in 1864 during the last dark years of the war, and he was the quietest of the three. Quiet even as an infant, watching the world from his mother's arms with wide gray eyes that were copies of his father's. The Civil War touched the cave property only lightly. Kentucky's agonized neutrality and the ridge's physical isolation kept the worst of the fighting at a distance, though the war was audible even here, in the sound of distant artillery carried on the wind, in the columns of smoke that rose from burning farms in the valleys, in the faces of the men who sometimes appeared on the trail, thin and desperate and wearing scraps of blue or gray. Confederate foragers came through once in the autumn of 1862, took the mule and most of the stored food, and left without violence. Union soldiers passed through the hollow the following spring, noted the cave entrance with professional interest. Caves had military uses, and moved on when Silas showed them it contained only crystals, books, and a nursing mother. The tours stopped during the war years but resumed in 1866, stronger than before. The country, exhausted and grieving, seemed hungry for wonders that had nothing to do with human cruelty, and the Crystal Cave offered exactly that. Beauty that was ancient and indifferent and enduring, that had been growing in darkness while men slaughtered each other above, and that would go on growing long after the last veteran was dust. Denton Crenshaw died in 1868. He had not managed the family farm well. The tobacco market had collapsed during the war, and Denton, who had neither the temperament for adaptation nor the humility to seek advice, had doubled down on tobacco when wiser men were diversifying. Margaret's expensive tastes hadn't helped. She had a gift for spending money that matched her husband's gift for failing to earn it. By 1866, the farm was mortgaged. By 1867, it was mortgaged twice. Denton died of a stroke in March of 1868, sitting in the same chair where he'd once offered Silas a job as a hired hand, and Margaret sold the property 3 months later for less than the debt on it, and moved to her sister's house in Virginia. She was not heard from again. Wallace fared somewhat better, but not much. The general store survived the war but lost its trade to a larger operation that opened in 1870 with more capital and better connections. Wallace sold out at a loss and moved to Cincinnati, where he worked as a clerk in a dry goods warehouse until his own death in 1879. A quiet, unremarkable ending to a quiet, unremarkable life. Silas learned of Denton's death from the mail rider and sat with the news for a long time in the great room. What he felt was not satisfaction. He had never wished his brothers ill, not even in the angriest years, not even when they'd laughed at his inheritance. What he felt was something closer to sorrow for the waste of it. Brothers who could have been partners, an inheritance that could have been shared, a family that could have held together and instead had flown apart like shrapnel. He did not attend the funeral, but he sent money to Margaret, $50, a substantial sum, with no note attached. She never acknowledged it. He did not expect her to. Purpose was a stronger medicine than bitterness, and Silas had never lacked for purpose. The years between 1868 and 1881 were the years of flowering, when the cave and the family around it came into their fullest expression. The cave's reputation grew steadily. Professor Harmon, now chair of geology at Transylvania, brought his students every spring for field study. Other academics followed, from the University of Kentucky, from Louisville, from as far as Cornell and Princeton. A writer for Harper's Weekly visited in 1872 and published a long illustrated piece that described the crystal chamber in terms that, while scientifically imprecise, were poetically effective and brought a surge of new visitors. Silas raised his tour prices modestly, $3 standard, $8 for the extended tour, and added a new element, overnight stays. He'd built a series of small sleeping alcoves in the upper passages, each fitted with a wooden platform, a clean straw mattress, a wool blanket, and a lantern. Guests could spend the night inside the cave, wrapped in the steady warmth while winter raged outside, and many of them described the experience as something close to transformative. "I have never slept so soundly in my life," wrote a banker from Lexington in the guest book Silas kept near the entrance. "The silence is not empty. It is full." The children grew into themselves. Thomas, the eldest, showed his father's aptitude for observation and his mother's gift for organization. He apprenticed himself to a surveyor in Harlan at 16 and returned at 20 with the skills to properly map the cave system. His survey, completed in 1881, revealed that the cave extended far beyond what Silas had explored, nearly half a mile of passages, branching and rejoining through the limestone ridge, including 3 additional crystal chambers that rivaled the first in beauty, if not in size. Eleanor took after Clara in temperament and intellect. She went to a women's seminary in Louisville and returned with a teaching certificate and a conviction that education was the only reliable tool for improving the human condition. She established a small school on the property in 1883, teaching reading, mathematics, and natural history to the children of the surrounding hollows, many of whom had never held a book. She taught them in the great room when the weather was bad, and the children sat among the fossils and mineral specimens and learned their letters by lantern light, which was, Eleanor said, the proper light for learning, warm and steady and patient. James, the youngest, was the quiet one, quieter even than Silas, which was saying something. He loved the cave the way some people love music, not as a thing to be studied or profited from, but as a thing to be experienced. He spent hours in the crystal chamber, sitting motionless, watching the lantern light play across the formations. When he was 14, He began carving small, precise figures in limestone and hardwood that captured the shapes of the crystals with startling accuracy. By 20, his carvings were selling in shops in Lexington and Louisville, and people who knew about such things were calling him an artist. The storm came in January of 1882. It had been a mild winter until then. Deceptively mild, the old-timers said, shaking their heads with the satisfaction that old-timers derive from predicting disaster. The signs were there if you knew how to read them. The unusual thickness of the woolly caterpillar's fur, the early departure of the geese, the way the creek had dropped to a trickle in December as the ground froze deeper than usual, the restless behavior of the squirrels, the heavy-massed crop the oaks had dropped in October as if stockpiling for something. Silas read the signs because reading signs was what he did. He'd been recording weather patterns for 26 years by then, and his notebooks, dozens of them, each meticulously maintained and cross-referenced by Clara's indexing system, represented one of the most detailed private meteorological records in the state of Kentucky. He knew what a mild early winter followed by a deep ground freeze meant. The mildness was not clemency. It was a held breath. The storm announced itself on the morning of January 14th with a barometric pressure drop so sudden and severe that Clara's homemade barometer looked broken. The straw indicator dropped as if someone had pushed it. The sky went from overcast to a bruised greenish gray in less than an hour, the clouds so low they seemed to scrape the ridge. The temperature, which had been a pleasant 38 degrees at dawn, began to fall, not gradually, the way temperatures usually fall, but in a plunge, like a stone dropped from a height. By noon, it was 12 degrees and dropping. The wind came from the northwest, screaming across the ridges and through the hollows with a ferocity that stripped branches from trees and drove the snow, when it came, an hour later, horizontally through the air in sheets so thick that visibility dropped to 20 feet. This was not a normal snowstorm. This was what the old Kentuckians called a blue norther, an Arctic air mass that had swept down from the Canadian plains with nothing to slow it, gathering cold and fury across 1,000 miles of open ground. Silas watched the sky from the cave entrance, felt the wind cutting through his coat like it wasn't there, and made a decision that took him less than 30 seconds. He sent Thomas on horseback down to Harlan with a message. It was not a request, and it was not polite. It was written on a page torn from a notebook, in Silas's small, precise handwriting, and it said, "Anyone who needs shelter, send them up the ridge trail. The cave holds at 56 degrees in all weather. Bring blankets, food, and warm clothing for the ride. Come now, this storm will kill people." Thomas delivered the message to every house and business on the main street of Harlan, shouting to be heard over the rising wind. Some people nodded immediately and began gathering their families. Others hesitated, uncertain whether to trust their own walls or a cave they'd joked about for 25 years. A few laughed outright. "Hide in a cave?" said Hiram Prewitt, who owned the feed store and had opinions about everything. "My house has a fireplace and 4 walls, which is more than Crenshaw's hole in the ground can claim." Hiram Prewitt's house had a fireplace and 4 walls, and neither of those things mattered when the temperature hit 23 degrees below zero, because that's what happened. By nightfall on January 14th, the temperature in Harlan County had dropped to -4 degrees Fahrenheit. By midnight, it was -11. By dawn on January 15th, the mercury in thermometers across the county had retreated into their bulbs and refused to come out. But the best estimates, assembled later from the few instruments that survived the cold, put the temperature at somewhere between -20 and -28. At -28, the rules of survival change. Firewood burns but does not warm a house, because the heat from a fireplace is swallowed by the cold air that pours in through every crack and gap in a wooden structure. And every wooden structure has cracks and gaps no matter how well built. Water pipes burst. Water in buckets freezes solid. Livestock freeze standing up in their stalls, their breath turning to ice on their muzzles. Exposed skin develops frostbite in minutes. The wind, still howling at 30 and 40 miles an hour, drove the wind chill to temperatures that belong to the Arctic, not to Kentucky. The first families began arriving at the cave by late afternoon on the 14th, before the worst of it hit. They came on foot, on horseback, in wagons, bundled in everything they owned, children crying, dogs slinking along behind with their tails clamped between their legs. The ridge trail was treacherous, slippery with ice and snow, and the wind hit them broadside on the exposed sections. But they came. They came because they had heard the caveman's message, and even if they had laughed at him for 25 years, they knew, in the way that people know things they would rather not admit, that he was probably right. Silas and Clara and Thomas and Eleanor met them at the cave entrance and guided them inside. Blankets were distributed. Lanterns were lit. The iron stove was stoked and a pot of coffee set to boiling. The cave accepted them the way it accepted everything, calmly, steadily, without judgment. 56 degrees. The same temperature it had been when Silas first pressed his palm against the wall 26 years earlier. The same temperature it had been when the first human beings walked the Kentucky hills 10,000 years ago. The same temperature it would be 1,000 years hence, long after everyone now breathing inside it was forgotten. By the end of the first night, there were 47 people in the cave. By the end of the second night, there were 112. They came from Harlan and from the surrounding hollows, entire families carrying what they could grab, leaving behind houses that were becoming death traps as the cold deepened and the wind found every weakness in every wall. Silas organized them with the same methodical calm he'd applied to every other problem the cave had posed him over a quarter century. The main passage and the great room became the primary living space. Clara set up a cooking station near the entrance, where the iron stove was kept burning continuously, not for warmth, which the cave provided without asking, but for hot food, coffee, and warm water. Thomas and James rigged lantern lines through all the occupied passages so that no one was ever in complete darkness. Eleanor organized the children, setting up a makeshift classroom in an alcove off the great room, where she read aloud from Silas's library, geology texts, adventure stories, poetry, whatever would hold their attention and keep the fear at bay. People slept on the plank floors, on the wooden platforms Silas had built for overnight guests, on blankets spread directly over bare limestone. It was not comfortable. It was not luxurious. It was not meant to be either of those things. It was meant to keep them alive, and it did. The storm lasted 3 days. On the worst night, January 15th, the temperature outside reached an estimated -28 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside the cave, at the farthest point from the entrance where the cold might have crept in, Silas's thermometer read 53 degrees, 3 degrees below normal. The mountain had noticed the storm. It had shivered slightly, the way a sleeping giant might shiver at a gust of wind, but it held. 200 million years of limestone held. The thermal mass of the ridge absorbed the cold at its surface and refused to transmit it inward, and the people inside slept in warmth that the earth itself provided, and not one of them froze. Outside, the damage was catastrophic. 14 houses in Harlan County lost their roofs to the wind. 6 barns collapsed under the combined weight of snow, ice, and wind pressure. Every creek, spring, and well in the county froze solid. 23 head of cattle died. The roads became impassable drifts. A man named Garner, who lived alone in a cabin on Laurel Creek, was found frozen in his bed 3 days after the storm broke. The fire in his stove long since burned to cold ash. But of the 112 people who sheltered in Silas Crenshaw's cave, not one was harmed. Not one suffered frostbite. Not one went hungry. The children, in fact, seemed to have enjoyed themselves. They would talk about the cave sleepover for years afterward, the way children talk about adventures that were frightening and wonderful in equal measure. Hiram Prewitt arrived at the cave on the second night, half frozen, his ears white with frostbite, supported on either side by his teenage sons. His fireplace and 4 walls had failed him at -15 degrees when the wind found the gaps in his clapboard siding and turned his parlor into an icebox. His wife and daughters were already at the cave, having ignored his stubbornness and come up the ridge that afternoon with a neighbor's family. Silas met Hiram at the entrance, took his arm without a word, and helped him inside. Clara brought hot coffee and wrapped his damaged ears in warm cloths soaked in water heated on the stove. Nobody said I told you so. Nobody needed to. The cave said it for them, in the only language it knew. 56 degrees, steady, patient, warm. Hiram Prewitt sat in the great room of the Crenshaw cave, surrounded by 100 other souls who had been saved by the steady warmth of 200 million years of limestone, and he wept. He was not the only one. The storm broke on January 17th. The wind died first, sometime before dawn, and the silence it left behind was so sudden and so absolute that it woke people from sleep. Then the sky cleared, and the sun came up on a world that had been scoured clean, trees stripped bare and glazed with ice that caught the light and turned every branch into a chandelier, the creek silent under a foot of solid ice, the snow unbroken and blinding white, the sky a washed-out blue that seemed apologetic after the violence it had permitted. The survivors emerged from the cave blinking and quiet, the way people emerge from any shared ordeal, bonded by the experience, but not yet ready to speak about it. They went home. They assessed the damage. They rebuilt. They did what people in the hills of Kentucky have always done after disaster, which is to put one foot in front of the other and keep walking. But something had changed in how they saw the man on the ridge, the caveman, the odd one, the reader. The youngest son who'd been given the useless inheritance and had the stubbornness or the madness to make something of it, was no longer a curiosity or a punchline. He was something else entirely, something that the people of Harlan County didn't have a precise word for, but understood instinctively. A man who had seen what they couldn't see, who had known what they didn't know, and who had used that knowledge not to enrich himself at their expense, but to hold out his hand when the storm came. They didn't call him a hero, because that word embarrassed him and would have embarrassed them. What they called him, after that January, was simply Crenshaw, spoken in a tone that carried more respect than any title or honorific could convey. The town council of Harlan passed a resolution in March of 1882, recognizing Silas Crenshaw's service during what they officially called the Great Cold of 1882. The resolution was printed in the county newspaper and read aloud at a town meeting that Silas did not attend because he was in the cave, recording the resumption of normal water flow patterns in the third corridor and noting that the crystal formations in the first chamber showed no signs of disturbance from the temperature fluctuation. The crystals did not care about resolutions. Neither, if he was being honest, did Silas. What mattered was the work. More practically, the county allocated funds to improve the ridge trail, widening it, grading the steepest sections, installing drainage ditches to prevent washouts, so that the cave could serve as an official emergency shelter in future storms. Silas agreed to this readily and contributed his own labor to the project, spending 3 weeks that spring hauling stone and grading trail alongside the county road crew, who had never worked with a man so quiet or so tireless. Professor Harmon, who heard about the storm and the rescue through his university connections, wrote a paper about the cave's thermal properties for the American Journal of Science, using Silas's 26 years of temperature data as primary evidence. The paper was widely read and cited, and it contributed to a growing understanding of geothermal regulation that would, decades later, inform the design of earth-sheltered buildings and geothermal heating systems across the world. Harmon dedicated the paper to S. Crenshaw, whose patience and precision put many trained scientists to shame. Silas read the dedication once, nodded, and filed the paper with the others. The last decade of Silas Crenshaw's life was quiet in the way that deep water is quiet, still on the surface, rich with movement underneath. The cave tours continued, managed increasingly by Thomas, who had married a schoolteacher named Anne from Barberville and settled in a house he built near the base of the Ridge Trail. Thomas had his father's way with visitors, calm, knowledgeable, patient, and his mother's head for accounts, and the business prospered modestly under his stewardship. Anne added her own contribution. She began a guest registry that collected not just names and dates, but impressions, questions, and sketches from visitors, creating a record that would prove invaluable to future historians. Eleanor's school grew to serve 30 students from the surrounding hollows, funded in part by the county, and in part by a small endowment that Silas and Clara had established from the tour income. Eleanor taught reading, mathematics, natural history, and what she called observation, the art of looking at the world carefully and recording what you saw. Her students went into the cave once a month, notebooks in hand, and learned to identify stalactites and stalagmites, to read the story written in the layers of stone, to understand why the air was warm and why the crystals grew. Some of them went on to become surveyors, teachers, pharmacists, a doctor. One of them, a girl named Sarah Combs, from a hollow so remote it didn't have a name, went on to study geology at the University of Kentucky, the first woman in the program, and devoted her career to the study of Kentucky cave systems. She kept a photograph of Eleanor Crenshaw on her office wall for 40 years. James, the youngest, had moved to Louisville by 1880, where his carvings sold well, and his reputation grew steadily among people who cared about craft and beauty. He carved limestone and hardwood, and occasionally bone, and the subjects of his work were always the same: crystals, cave formations, the shapes of water and stone and time. He came home every autumn, arriving on the Ridge Trail with his tools and his quiet manner, and he always spent his first night back sitting alone in the crystal chamber, the way a churchgoer returns to a familiar pew. He never married. He said the cave was enough company, and perhaps it was. Clara's health began to fail in 1887. A cough that appeared that winter and refused to leave became a persistent weakness, a slow unwinding that no amount of warm cave air could arrest. She bore it with the same quiet precision she brought to everything, managing her illness the way she managed the accounts, methodically, without complaint, without drama, cataloging her symptoms in a small notebook as if they were data points rather than suffering. She continued her work until 3 weeks before the end, maintaining the index, updating the guest book, writing letters to Professor Harmon, and to the growing network of scientists and visitors who had become, over the decades, a kind of extended family. She died on March 12, 1889, in the bedroom they'd built together inside the cave, in the steady 56-degree warmth that had cradled their marriage for 32 years. Silas held her hand and did not speak. Outside the cave, March was doing what March does in Kentucky, swinging between winter and spring, cold rain and warm sun, the dogwoods not yet blooming but thinking about it. Inside, the temperature held. The crystals, somewhere deep in their sealed chamber, went on growing at the rate of a few molecules per year, indifferent to grief, indifferent to love, indifferent to everything except the slow, faithful work of becoming. There are silences that contain more than any words can carry, and this was one of them. The cave held them both, the living and the dying, in the same even warmth, making no distinction, playing no favorites. They buried Clara on the ridge near the cave entrance, under a limestone marker carved by James. The stone read simply, Clara Holtz Crenshaw, 1833 to 1889. She measured everything and missed nothing. Silas lived 4 more years after Clara. He was slower. He was quieter, though that hardly seemed possible. But he was not diminished. He continued his observations, the notebooks, the temperature readings, the careful recording of water flow and crystal growth and barometric pressure. He still guided the occasional tour, though Thomas handled most of them now. He spent long hours in the great room, reading and rereading the books that he and Clara had discussed so often that reading them felt like continuing a conversation with her. Sometimes he read aloud, to no one, and to her, and his voice would echo softly in the stone chamber and come back to him changed. The way the lantern light came back from the crystals changed, the same, but altered by the passage. He took to sitting at the cave entrance in the evenings, watching the sunset paint the ridge in colors that shifted from gold to rose to purple, the hollows below filling with blue shadow, while the highest trees still caught the light. He would sit there until the stars came out, and sometimes he would talk to Bishop's successor, a mule named Psalm, because Clara had named him, about nothing in particular, the way old men talk to animals when they have outlived the need to impress anyone. His last notebook entry, dated November 8, 1893, read, Tempet Great Room, 56 degrees Fahrenheit, barometric pressure steady, 3rd corridor water flow resuming after dry October. Crystal growth in Chamber 1 continues nominal. Wind from the southwest, mild. Good day. He died on December 2nd, 1893, at the age of 67. Thomas found him in the morning, sitting in his reading chair in the great room, a book open on his lap, and the lantern burned down to its last 1/4 inch of oil. The cave was 56 degrees. The crystals glittered in the fading lamplight. The mountain breathed around him, steady as it had breathed for 100 million years, and would breathe for 100 million more. Thomas closed the book, noting the page. It was Harmon's geology text, the same one that had first taught Silas to see the earth not as dead matter, but as a living, remembering thing. Thomas held the book for a moment, feeling its weight, and then he placed it on the shelf beside Clara's notebooks, and Silas's notebooks, and the guest books, and the letters from professors and visitors, and the clipping from Harper's Weekly, and all the other evidence of a life built slowly, carefully, and well, like a crystal in the dark. The funeral was the largest Harlan County had seen in a generation. People came from the hollows and the hill farms, from town and from the surrounding counties, people who had sheltered in the cave 11 years earlier, people who had taken his tours, people who had simply heard the name Crenshaw and understood that it meant something worth honoring. Hiram Prewitt, now old and stooped and walking with a cane, stood at the graveside and removed his hat and held it over his heart and did not put it back on until every shovel of earth had been placed. He stood there a long time after the others had gone, looking at the cave entrance above the grave, and what he was thinking he never told anyone. They buried Silas on the ridge beside Clara, near the cave entrance where the warm air breathed outward in winter and inward in summer, so that the two of them would feel the mountain's breath forever. The headstone was simple limestone. What else would it be? Carved by James, who came from Louisville and spent 3 days working it with his father's chisels and his own artist's eye. It read, Silas Crenshaw, 1826 to 1893. He listened to the mountain. The cave endures. Thomas Crenshaw operated it as a geological attraction and community emergency shelter until his own death in 1921, by which time his son, Silas's grandson, named Silas after his grandfather, had taken over the stewardship. The crystal chambers were studied over the following decades by geologists from the University of Kentucky, the Smithsonian Institution, and several European universities. The calcite spar formations were confirmed to be among the finest in the eastern United States, and the cave's remarkably consistent thermal properties became a standard case study in undergraduate geology courses, a real-world demonstration of geothermal regulation, thermal mass, and natural convection that no textbook diagram could match. The temperature inside, measured by digital instruments in the 21st century, averages 56.2 degrees Fahrenheit. It has not meaningfully changed since Silas Crenshaw first pressed his palm against the wall in October of 1856. It will not meaningfully change in our lifetimes, or our children's, or theirs. The ridge trail is paved now, and there is a small visitor center where Josiah Ridley's cabin once stood. Eleanor's school, which served children of the Hollows for nearly 40 years, became a county institution before closing in the 1960s, but the building still stands and is used as a community center. James's carvings are in the permanent collection of the Speed Art Museum in Louisville, small, luminous pieces that capture the geometry of crystal growth with a precision that owes as much to Heinrich Holtz's clockwork as it does to the Kentucky limestone. Clara's homemade barometer, the glass jar, the India rubber, the wheat straw, sits in a display case at the visitors' center, next to the first of Silas's leather-bound notebooks, open to the page where he recorded his initial temperature observations in October of 1856. People still come to spend the night in the cave. They come for the crystals, and for the history, and for the peculiar, ancient peace of sleeping inside something so much older and so much more patient than anything they will ever know. Some of them, lying awake in the gentle darkness, wrapped in the warmth of the earth, feel what Silas felt on his first night in October. The slow unclenching of something long held tight, the quiet recognition that the earth is not indifferent to us, but simply patient, patient beyond our ability to comprehend, and warm, always warm, in the deep places where it matters. There's always more to find. Silas said that, or something like it, to anyone who would listen, and to his children, and to the visitors who came from far away, to see what a youngest son had made of 40 acres of nothing useful. There's always another passage, another formation, another degree of understanding. The mountain doesn't give up its secrets willingly, but it gives them up eventually, to anyone who cares enough to stay and listen. He was the youngest son. He inherited a cave, and when the storm came, the cave, and the man who had spent 26 years understanding it, held a whole town in its warm, dark arms, and none of them were cold.